and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by CTMfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most. I am your host, Pushpendra Mehta. Joining me today are Paul Galloway, Senior Director, Advisory Services at Strategic Treasurer, and Ben Poole, Writer at CTMfile. A very warm welcome to you, Paul and Ben.
Thanks, Push.
Thanks, Push.
Thank you for taking the time to participate in this edition of the Open Treasury podcast and for sharing your viewpoint with us on topics that impact the world of treasury management and beyond. In this episode, we shall discuss three topics, namely the implications for corporations should the Israel-Palestine conflict spread into a wider war, U.S. Faster Payments Council releases first operational considerations for instant payments, guidelines, and finally, China is celebrating a decade of its Belt and Road Initiative. Our audience can read articles, interviews, and industry roundups by visiting CTMfile.com or by following the links in our show notes. Let's commence today's discussion with the first story, which is about implications for corporations should the Israel-Palestine conflict spread into a wider war. Armed conflicts and wars displace and destroy human capital, damage the social and economic fabric of warring nations, and endanger civil liberties. Cross-border incursions also have an adverse impact on local and international companies operating within the conflict zone and beyond. The ongoing Israeli-Palestinian military conflict may be no exception, as it is the deadliest in several decades. There are over 500 multinational corporations operating in Israel. Several global companies have temporarily suspended operations in Israel or asked employees to work from home. While the impact of the Israel-Palestinian war on the global economy is likely to be limited, as both nations are not significant oil producers, that could change if the conflict escalates or spills over to the rest of the Middle East, particularly Iran, as their involvement may then risk pulling the US into the conflict. In such a scenario, there are primary risks and implications for corporates and the wider global economy, such as surge in oil prices, another wave of inflation, higher for longer interest rate scenario, the likely closure of Strait of Hormuz that could disrupt the region's supply chains and impact international trade, a full-blown cyber warfare, and a new geopolitical risk that may boost gold as a safe haven asset and strengthen the dollar. Paul, from a corporate treasury perspective, what are the key implications should the Israel-Palestine conflict spread and turn into a wider war in the Middle East?
Yeah, Push, this article does a good job of laying out some of those key areas. In particular, we'll start with oil. Oil is the big stick in this area. We have already heard saber rattling out of Iran calling for oil embargo. As the article points out, there's a strait that is often used for sending oil out to nations around the world. It accounts for about 30% of the total oil supply. If this conflict spreads, oil embargo hits, we're going to see oil prices rise significantly. Bloomberg had posted out there the other day they're anticipating potentially oil at $150, which is significantly high compared to where we have been recently. So you're talking about almost doubling oil prices. And then a potential constraint on the supply of oil, which will further exacerbate the issue. Unfortunately, as things are today, oil is still a very important commodity globally. When we talk about the impact here in a very regional location, it's significant. So issues with that going the direction that people really don't want it to go include more strain from an economic standpoint. And we're already in a position globally where economies are struggling. We continue to see mixed data out of many nations around the world globally. Interest rates are at an all-time high compared to more recent years. And they may be there at that level for a much longer period than anticipated, especially when you think about the risks of a broader war. So I think there is a significant chance that we could see constraints to oil supply here in the very near term. The other thing that is of big concern, and we saw reports out there, they're wondering, how did Hamas make its way into Israel? There was a cyber attack on infrastructure that prevented them from detecting the Hamas terrorists coming into Israel to do what they did. So, and several days later, there was more cyber attacks. So we've seen an elevated level of issues around cyber attacks. Cybersecurity is more important. This shouldn't be looked at as just a regional issue. Like oil, it has an impact globally. I believe that there's potential or risk for additional cybersecurity issues outside of the region. So this could broaden itself to become more of a global increase compared to what we, well, quote unquote, have normally seen in recent times. So we could see an influx of risks around cybersecurity. So treasurers need to be aware of those risks and take appropriate steps to shore up the interior and the perimeter and make sure that they have the right controls in place and systems to prevent a cyber attack from displacing their business either temporarily or longer term. Some of the other things that this article pointed out was around gold as a safe haven. Gold, to me, I'm an investment guy by trade. Gold is not an investment, and this article points out, just that. Gold is not an investment, but it's looked at as a hedge against broader risks that are happening on a global economic basis. And so I do believe we are going to see a push or a demand for gold, which will push up prices. We also will see an impact on the dollar because the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency today. And when conflicts like this occur, people seek safe havens like gold, but they also seek the US dollar, which will strengthen the US dollar. It's going to make the decision making on the Fed side more problematic and challenging in an environment where they're hoping to not have to continue to raise rates to slow things down, but a strengthening dollar is certainly something that the U.S. doesn't want to see. It'll hit bottom line earnings for U.S.-based companies. So I think investment in U.S. will continue to be something that is going to be not as strong as what we want. So I think we're going to see some waning on investment in U.S. As a result of this. The other thing with a strong U.S. dollar is for international global companies that trade in or supply services in local currencies. There's going to be a challenge to managing the FS risk associated with a rise in the dollar and volatility in currencies. So I think treasurers really have to keep an eye on managing foreign currency in today's environment. And so if they don't have natural hedges in place, they should be looking at their profile and how they can manage the risk of volatility in currencies, because it's probably going to continue here in the near term. So something for treasurers to keep an eye on.
Yeah, great points, Paul. Obviously, thoughts are with the civilian populations on both sides of this conflict. But for corporates, it really underlines the impact of geopolitical risk on operations. Something that was already, I think, in the minds of treasurers and CFOs earlier in the year. A survey of businesses from Oxford Economics found that geopolitical risk was cited by 36 respondents as the biggest risk that companies were expecting to have to manage over the coming 2 years ahead of us, surpassing things like the financial crisis or inflation expectations, tightening credit supply and trade tensions. So it was something that I think in general was on the radar from a long way out. Specifically with this conflict, several multinationals that have a presence in Israel have been forced to adjust their operations. I think Chevron, the US oil and gas producer, was directed by Israel's energy ministry to shut down the Tamar natural gas field off the country's northern coast. So that's just one example of how companies that have a presence in the region are being affected. And obviously there's quite a big impact on trade as well. Some of the Israeli ports that are very close to the Gaza border won't be operating at full capacity as a result. And beyond that, there could be a disruption to Israel's main trading partners. So their exports to China are quite substantial, I think around 4.68 billion. But the conflict could obviously disrupt trade flows. The US, another critical trade partner with a strong focus on exports. Israel exports goods worth around $18.5 billion to the US, including high-tech products and defense-related items. So this conflict could potentially maybe strain diplomatic relations between those two countries, potentially having a knock-on impact on exports. So, and that's just two countries. Obviously, there's a lot of other countries. Germany, India are also kind of crucial trading partners with Israel. And more practically, companies with offices and operations in the region are kind of having to think about the sort of support that they can offer to their workers there. Obviously, many, I suppose, Israeli nationals won't want to leave the country. What can corporates do to support employees that are staying there? You know, physical resources, but also sort of even mental health sessions, things that you can do over Zoom, over the video links that we found so indispensable during the pandemic. I think it's another opportunity for those to just kind of keep in touch of the people and what's going on. So yeah, it's definitely a lot for corporates to be thinking on.
A lot for the corporates to be thinking on. That was quite a thought-provoking analysis, Paul and Ben. You know, history teaches us that nations at war have to pay a very hefty price. The human costs are immeasurable. The economic repercussions of a deadly military clash won't just hurt Israelis and Palestinians. There will also be a collateral damage in different parts of the world. So you're absolutely right on that, both of you. And we hope that peace prevails and the conflict comes to an end soon. Let's shift the conversation to our next topic, which is about the US Faster Payments Council, or FPC, a membership organization devoted to advancing safe, easy to use faster payments in the US, having published its first operational considerations for instant payments guideline as a resource for financial institutions supporting instant payment rails. Ben, you covered this story for CTMfile. So if I may direct this question to you first, given that instant payments is on the rise in the US thanks to FedNow and RTP, can you throw light on some of the topics that are covered in the first guideline that you think will provide a springboard for financial institutions to more effectively plan their journey toward faster payments adoption?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, Push, instant payments are transforming the US payments ecosystem, and this FPC document serves as a primer on receive-side operational considerations for instant payments, with quite high-level insights on priorities to consider for banks when adopting this new method of receipt. So it covers a huge range of considerations, from new processes in relation to existing payment flows, liquidity management processes for reconciling incoming funds in real time, things like fraud mitigation, exception processing, regulations and compliance, and more. So it really is quite comprehensive. So I'll just pick out a couple of the points. On the liquidity side, Financial institutions that participate in the FedNow service and the clearinghouse's CHIPS and RTP systems face the additional challenge of managing two separate liquidity positions, as well as a combined overall liquidity position in their reserve account at the Fed. For example, money held intraday for the RTP system can't be used for FedWire transactions. So that's just a consideration around liquidity that the banks need to pay attention to. The report also comments on the technology infrastructure in banks. We often talk about how legacy technology is holding banks back, and how much of their investment budget actually just goes on keeping the lights on rather than being able to innovate. And this report notes that to facilitate receive-only instant payments through RTP or FedNow, banks and financial institutions need to have a modern technology infrastructure in place that includes instant payment processing and compliance platforms, API integration, payment gateways, and fraud detection mechanisms, of course, as well. So banks need to consider factors such as the processing speed of transactions, uptime and rejects when designing their systems, and make sure they've got mechanisms in place to achieve these new performance requirements, such as real-time monitoring or capacity planning and disaster recovery. So there's a lot, and the report goes into a bit more detail on lots of different considerations across many of those areas that I mentioned at the start. So those were just a couple of points that I wanted to pull out. Of course, once banks are fully up to speed, no pun intended, they can get to kind of building tools and solutions for their corporate clients that solve specific needs. So I think it's an exciting time at the moment, but obviously one that will require a lot of investment of time and no doubt money as well from banks to really make the most of what's available to them.
Yeah, Ben, when I think about the introduction of FedNow earlier this year, it's an important step forward here in the U.S., considering real-time payments being the private sector way of doing faster payments or instant payments. Only about 60% of all the banks in the U.S. are part of that private group, and FedNow opens it up to all financial institutions in the U.S. So it's a significant step forward now. The adoption by, I'll take an example here, small banks in rural Iowa. We're talking farming communities, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the state of Iowa in the U.S., it is an ag state, primarily corn, soybeans, chickens, turkeys, cows, pigs. It's an ag state. And so there's a lot of small farming communities that have these small banks that now can participate in FedNow. I think is an important step forward. The one difference between FedNow and real-time payments right now, beyond that the Fed is backing FedNow, that is significant in itself and could have an impact on use of real-time payments versus FedNow, is that with real-time payments, you can request payments. You can't currently do that with FedNow. That's something that is on the horizon. So eventually, FedNow will have those capabilities. Then the two platforms look a lot familiar, or similar, I should say. And, then it's a matter of what the users of the banks, I should say, that what it is that they want to use it for and how that impacts their balance sheet. As Ben pointed out earlier, I think he was talking about real-time payments and inclusion of that on reserve balances. So I think banks will have to definitely make those considerations. But when it comes to instant payments in the U.S., FedNow was certainly a huge step forward. I think the adoption rate of this is going to pick up steam, and we're going to see a lot more people participating. So having operational considerations as a guideline from FPC, I think is important for these banks so that they have something that they can go to as reference to understand and consider the various aspects of engaging in one or both of these platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be fascinating to see what sort of solutions and advantages there are for businesses to use these instant payments networks, what the benefits are, and also what kind of happens with the levels in terms of the volumes that you can transfer over these networks. This year has been a very exciting development in terms of how the US has kind of now doubled the amount of real-time payments rails it's got, but I think there's still a lot more development to happen, and look forward to seeing how that plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. And as is pointed out in this article, and you mentioned, Ben, liquidity management being a uber important factor for treasurers. This is just another tool in the toolkit for helping them manage that more efficiently.
Those are great insights. Our next topic in today's discussion revolves around China celebrating a decade of its Belt and Road Initiative. China is hosting a summit marking the 10th anniversary of its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, an ambitious yet controversial undertaking to boost connectivity and trade across the world with Chinese money and know-how in infrastructure development. Since its launch a decade ago, the Belt and Road Initiative has poured hundreds of billions of dollars to power the construction of bridges, ports, highways, power plants, and telecom projects across Latin America, Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. However, the massive undertaking has been plagued by criticism. China has been accused of straddling developing countries with crippling debt, as well as environmental costs. But the primary concern is risky lending, with critics accusing China of saddling low and middle income governments with overly high levels of debt relative to their GDPs. Paul, in a likely scenario that China will be navigating the second decade of the BRI amid stark economic challenges at home, and other countries also increasing their own efforts towards supporting infrastructure projects in the developing world, what do you think are the key risks of financing such infrastructure development projects that can directly or indirectly impact either the global financial system or the fortunes of multinational corporations that operate in the developing and developed world?
Yeah, Push. Some of the things that come to mind when reading this article is the thought process from China's perspective of why they are going into the developing countries, pushing cash in there for build out of infrastructure, and as you pointed out, saddling these countries with a significant amount of debt to finance that. So, their drive to do that is pretty clear. They obviously want to push the U.S. out of its position as the world's reserve currency. They want to take that next step to be a global economic superpower. They don't seem to be waning away from that. The risks that are definitely there are that if China decides to step away from some of these developing countries, it could really put them in a substantial economic pinhole where without the continued support of China in their region or their country, it could have a downturn economically. So I think there's definitely risk of China potentially shifting gears at any moment if they decide to, which could really hurt some of these countries that are working on these infrastructure projects. So I see that as probably one of the bigger things for these countries to consider as this is going on. When I think about the relationship that China has with Russia and what's going on there, I think there are some challenges for China because I think when they went into the relationship to have more of an economic relationship, I think China thought they were going to get more out of it than what they're getting. And what they're getting now is several months after doing this agreement, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. And Ukraine has turned out to be a real mess. We now have Russia going to North Korea to get ammunition, which is just another step in wrong direction in terms of what's going on there in Ukraine. And Ukraine's not giving up. So, I think China's got some distractions as well. So I don't know, what do the next 10 years for the BRI, what does that look like? I think it's not going to go as smooth as what China was hoping for. There's headwinds both from a geopolitical standpoint and an economic standpoint. So I suspect there's going to be a slowdown in what we've seen happen compared to the first 10 years of this initiative. Now, does that mean that China stops? I don't think it means they stop. It may be that they pause in some areas, which could present some of those economic challenges to these developing countries. And in other areas, they may continue to push forward. So I think there's potentially some winners and losers in terms of what the BRI decides to do over the next decade.
Great points then. Particularly, I think that, the geopolitical angle again is strong in this story. And also the point you made, Paul, about the kind of the slowdown in the China economy impacting the overall growth of the BRI is definitely going to have an impact. And perhaps what might have been planned out 10 years ago for the next phase is going to take a lot longer to get done. NPR published an article looking at this anniversary yesterday that I was reading, and included a quote from Hong Zhang, who is a researcher at Harvard Kennedy School who studies China's international development engagements. And she said that China wants to project an impression that it's championing the agenda of economic development, namely through infrastructure building and industrialization. At the same time, Beijing has taken advantage of many critiques of the Western countries' approach to foreign aid, which kind of contains conditionalities related to good governance, human rights. So Beijing's trying to portray itself as a more pragmatic partner. How you can stack that up against the debt picture on the other side, the truth is probably somewhere between the two. For treasurers, the opportunity that this presents, the greater connections between diverse countries, they'll likely need cash management services from banking partners if they're expanding or growing in that region in order to manage things like payables and receivables, as well as collections, debt servicing accounts, because there's complex regulatory requirements across all these different countries with different rules and regulations as to what you can and can't do in each one. And companies working with Chinese counterparties might need special assistance with settling transactions, for example, and escrow facilities might be necessary to facilitate secure investment, given the characteristics of the region. So there's a lot to think about if you're a company that's been kind of looking at this development of the BRI and seeing what opportunities it creates. So a lot to ponder 10 years in, definitely.
Yeah, certainly is, Ben. So, it's something for not only the U.S. to keep an eye on, but globally, I think other countries should keep an eye on the activity that comes out of the BRI. I think it's going to be telling in terms of what China's strategy is going forward. Definitely believe it's going to shift. What direction that goes, I don't know for sure.
On that note, I'm going to ask both of you for your final views, which is, what is your choice for the biggest or most important story of the past week and why? Paul, can I ask you to do the honors first?
Yeah, Push. The biggest news story for me that could potentially have an impact for treasurers, and I think it already is in some instances for treasurers globally, is the conflict in Israel and Palestine. This is something that could and is showing signs of potentially expanding, which will have a global impact for sure. So I think this is significant. We've already seen quite a few lives lost on both sides. That's obviously something that's not economic, or you can put in economic terms when you lose lives like that. But certainly the global economic and geopolitical environment is at risk, as well as organizations' cybersecurity. So treasurers have a lot to consider and keep an eye on when it comes to currency, interest rates, cybersecurity. They're going to be on their toes here for a while as this continues to play out. The other thing I just wanted to note, Push, we have the AFP coming up in San Diego next week. Strategic Treasury will be there on site. We have a booth located at 2233 on the site map. If people are looking at the numbers of where people are, that's our booth number. We will be there. Please come by and say hi to me. I will be there throughout the AFP. Look forward to visiting people who listen to our podcast and hearing what they think about our content. I think it's pretty solid, and I look forward to seeing folks at AFP in San Diego next week.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, definitely go and say hi to Paul if you're at AFP next week in San Diego. My top story, Paul mentioned FX risk in our first story that we covered today. So I'd point to something that we published on CTMfile today, which highlights a survey saying that 62% of corporates suffer from a lack of transparency in the FX market. That's a significant number, particularly in the volatile times we're living in today. And that lack of visibility can have a material impact on the bottom line of corporates. The most recent Kyriba currency impact report from July found that FX headwinds had wiped out 22 billion in revenue from multinationals in Q1 this year. So a significant figure there. This Miltech FX survey that I quoted earlier does show some hope, though, in terms of the majority of corporates. I think it's 75% from their survey are looking at new tech and platforms to automate their FX operations and move away from the sort of manual legacy systems. So I would say just the cost of fixing this problem looks considerably cheaper than the cost of doing nothing for multinationals in that space. So just something to ponder.
You know, what's really interesting, Ben, is I can think about my former employer when I came on board. We had a hedging program, a team that ran hedging. Yeah, it wasn't tied, these were just tied to securities and interest rates. So it wasn't anything where they were doing FX hedging. The organization was US based, but it was getting into local currency denominated investments, which started putting currency risk on their balance sheet. And so they elected to initially accept the interest rate volatility. But I think today they may be reconsidering what they're doing there. I don't know for sure. But there's a lot of organizations out there that are managing their foreign currency with spreadsheets today. And they might have access to multiple portals for trading foreign currency versus a singular platform or a consolidated platform where they can maybe manage execution risk better. And I think seeing organizations move to these tech platforms, the fintech platforms that can help them manage the overall risk along with the trading, I think is going to be really important as we go forward. So I suspect that fintech companies that provide that kind of platform are going to see an influx of organizations looking for the tools that they need to manage that risk.
On that note, I'd like to thank you, Paul and Ben, ever so much for your valuable insights and thought-provoking analysis. I would request our CTMfile readers to please visit ctmfile.com to read the article that Ben pointed out about FX transparency. It's the top news story for today. I would also exhort you to go and drop by at the Strategic Treasurer's booth at the upcoming AFP 2023 and pick Paul's brain and get some insights, interesting insights. Drop by and say hi to him. Thank you so much to our CTMfile audience for joining us on this edition of Open Treasury. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you and have a great week. This podcast is provided for information purposes only, and statements made by CTMfile or guests on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, or consulting advice. For more information, visit ctmfile.com.